All right. I'd like now to introduce Alan Mackenzie, who is delivering the TransformELT sponsored showcase session. And Alan is the founding director of TransformELT and has been an English language teaching professional since 1989, starting in language schools in Japan, then moving to the tertiary sector. He has designed and taught master's level courses for Teachers College Columbia University and NILE. He has been a project manager for the British Council across East and South Asia. Over to you, Alan.
Hi, thanks, Leticia. Can you hear me okay? Jolly good. As Leticia said, I am a director of TransformELT. We're one of the sponsors of this conference, and we're delighted to be a sponsor for what I hope is going to continue to be a very stimulating conference. And there's been some really interesting presentations so far. Away from the theme that of the conference, which is on new pedagogies and methodologies, I'm not going to talk about a specific methodology because one of the things that we believe in TransformELT is that individuals, institutions, education systems need to choose their own pedagogies and make those pedagogies appropriate to the local context. Choose what pedagogies are most appropriate, what methodologies are most appropriate for your students at their particular level of development. And there is a huge range of different options out there. I don't believe it's my job to tell you which ones are the best for you. I think it's your job to choose which ones are best for you. So some of those ideas that Clyde had, for example, might be quite challenging for some contexts and for some people. I would love to try those out, though, and I think it would be great fun doing that with primary-aged children. One thing that might not be clear from my bio is that I have taught young learners in the past. I'm not just a university teacher, a master's level teacher. I love nothing better than getting interactive with young kids. And a lot of the development projects that we run in TransformELT are at the primary level and for primary teachers. The biggest project that we've dealt with so far is in Tunisia, which we're working on with ELT consultants, Wendy Arnold's group, and we're going to tell you more about that in depth tomorrow during a panel discussion in the evening. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, then please join us for that panel discussion. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. What I'm talking about in this presentation really is about TransformELT and what we do, what kinds of projects we do, how we go about doing them. If you go to our website and look at the approach section of the website, you'll see a write-up of what I'm talking about today. There's also quite a complex diagram that you'll see at the end of the presentation, which you can download from the website and have a look at it there. We've been in existence for 2.5 years now as an organization, and during those 2.5 years we've been busy. We've worked in 23 different countries around the world. You can see them all on the map there. We're just starting to do quite a lot of work in West Africa with the English Connects project that's happening there. I'm not going to tell you about all of our projects, but I am going to focus on 3 which will be of perhaps most interest to you. One is in Cuba, where we're developing a strategic action plan with the Ministry of Education and the British Council. We do most of our projects with the British Council because they are the most active agency out there in English language teaching and promoting the English language development. In Ethiopia, we also worked with the British Council for building a culture of coaching in Ethiopian primary schools. And that really was a cultural shift from what was a very command-driven, top-down form of teacher development to a much more reflective and interactive approach to teacher development. In France, we're working on a Clil for primary project, and in fact, that's moving towards early years. this year. This is our second year working on that project, and we're going to continue into next year. So I'll be using those as examples for the things I'm going to talk about throughout the presentation, and I'll come back to them each in a moment. So in Ethiopia, the project was working with school inspectors, head teachers, and key teachers within Ethiopian primary schools, focusing on improving the quality of English language learning in the schools and helping them to develop interactive games, methodologies for learning language. Previously, it had been quite lecture-based and teacher-fronted, and we were trying to get them to use more learner-centered approaches. At the same time, change the way that the school inspectors talked to teachers about their development, and making it more of a collaborative relationship rather than a top-down command-centric approach. The Cuban, I've already talked about Cuba, so I'll skip that slide. And in France, we had a similar approach to making the classes more interactive, more content-centered, building in language to content classes like maths and science, and trying to make it fun at the same time. You can see them, the teachers at the bottom, playing a word game, a vocabulary game with the post-its, and working on things like story circles and building content into English language stories to help develop the content base and the language at the same time. So the kinds of projects that we work on, first of all, when you decide you're going to make a change across an education system, it's very similar to deciding you're going to make a change in your classroom, really. You need to have a thorough understanding of the context. You need to know what the realities of working in that context are for the people in that situation. The kinds of approaches or ways of doing things need to be practical, they need to be useful to the people in that context, and they need to be clearly stated so that the people that are actually implementing the change have a very clear vision of what that change looks like and how they're going to manage to achieve that change. If they have that clear vision of the change state, then that's the first step towards helping them to build the skills, gain the knowledge to be able to achieve that vision, and ensure that they do that in a staged, step-by-step way that is not trying to change too much too quickly. There's an old cliche, evolution, not revolution. Revolutions are quite difficult and dangerous and can be quite damaging. So evolving the situation and making sure that the skills are built and scaffolded in an appropriate way is very important. So in Ethiopia, the vision was to enable these school people who talk to each other in schools about teaching, so the head teachers, the classroom teachers, and the school inspectors, to work together as a trio for each of the schools that we were working in. This was a project for 440 people, so there was quite a large training project across the Ethiopian state. It wasn't all schools in Ethiopia, but it was a large chunk. We were trying to get the head teachers and school inspectors and teachers to use those coaching skills on a daily basis as to help them to talk about their teaching and to help them to develop their whatever methodologies they wanted to introduce into their classrooms. In Cuba, we want Cuba to have a comprehensive development plan for English language teaching. At the moment, what they're doing is inviting guest lecturers from overseas to come and give talks to teachers on the ground. That might be useful, but it doesn't have a focus. There's no clear aim to it. It's really spending a lot of money just to bring some people over and put them on a stage for a couple of hours in an afternoon. And we don't think that that is going to be terribly useful to teachers. We think they need a different form of development, and we're trying to convince the Education Ministry to put together a real clear vision for what they want English language teaching to be, and a clear development plan to enable that to happen. In France, we want fun, interactive Clil lessons integrated regularly into classroom practice. France is experimenting quite a lot with Clil at the primary level. And experimenting is the key word. They're using different approaches in different schools, integrating things in different ways into the classroom environment. And so we're helping them to explore that and find out how to what methods work in the French primary context. So once you have your vision, you have to plan how to get to the point where that vision is going to become a reality. Key to that is having a flexible project design, because things happen. There are bumps in the road. It doesn't always go according to plan. In fact, I'll talk about the examples in a moment. If you're going to use a training course, and not all development projects require a training course, but if you're going to use a training course, then it needs to be practical, experiential, interactive, and it needs to model the kinds of practices that you want the teachers to take up and use in their own classrooms. Demonstrating that those good practices using methods such as loop input are very useful in getting teachers to understand what the methodology is, how it works, and how they can best use it in their context. That guidance on how to go about doing that, as I said, needs to be scaffolded. We need to have a clear framework for doing that, and it has to start from where the teachers are at the moment and move slowly towards the vision that you want to have in the classroom. Teacher development is a difficult process. It takes a lot of time and effort, and it needs to be we need to acknowledge that it will take time, that not everything is going to happen just because you tell teachers something new. They'll have to think about it for a while. They'll have to plan it. They'll have to experiment with it before it actually becomes a reality on the ground. And that process needs scaffolding. So in Ethiopia, what we did during the course for helping them to understand what coaching was having demonstration videos of teachers having taught a class, and a school inspector was observing the class, then the post-classroom observation. Actually, there were pre-observation and post-observation discussions, both videoed and demonstrated. We used quite a lot of role plays where the teachers were given a scenario of what happened in a class, and the coach was asked to deal with difficult situations as well as positive situations. And then we had a cycle of feedback that they got constant feedback on those role plays, then tried a new one and tried to implement the feedback that they were using, that they got for the previous role play. In Cuba, we're also modelling the development process with the Ministry of Education. We're trying to take them through a process that their schools will go through to enable them to develop a theory of change for the education system. Again, this is not something that happens very quickly. We need to base that on needs analysis. We need to base it on a real thorough understanding of what is happening on the ground. And to a certain extent, we need to teach the Ministry of Education to ask the right questions about the development process that they're having. It's not about going out and getting experts and bringing them into the country necessarily. There's Peter Senge, who talks about organizational change. One of his statements is that sick organizations look outside themselves for solutions. If an organization is a learning organization, is a healthy organization, it should be working from the inside and using the resources at its at its disposal to help it to move forward and to move forward from the place that the organization is at, rather than trying to jump to a different state, which is not going to work very well. In France, we changed the actual structure of the course. The French courses have an initial 3-day input session, and then the teachers go away and try those ideas in class and then come back for another 2 days where they get a little bit of input, but most of that is reporting back on what happened when they were in the classroom and moving the discussion forward, trying to get them to try new things out when they go back to school for the second time. So that's an interesting structural change, which makes the training feel a little bit bitty and is quite difficult to staff at times, but it does have value. And we're talking about in Tunisia using for these 5-day courses, which is quite a common pattern for education ministries. They want a 1-week training course, but taking a teacher out of class for a whole week is difficult, and we need to break it up to a certain extent. So in Tunisia, we're thinking about doing 2 days, and then 1 day at the end where they come back and review the progress that they've made over the past, could be 3-4 weeks by the time that they come back for a final day. So it's an interesting way of punctuating training over a period of time, because we've found that intensive training courses don't give people enough time to think of about what they need to do, and don't give them enough processing time to be able to properly put things into practice. But going back to school, thinking about it, trying out an idea, then coming back to the training room and trying out a new idea can be more beneficial. When we do these kinds of things, we organize these courses, we need to send people back to schools. We need to find out what's working, whether it's working, what is changing on the ground, and that requires monitoring the changes as it happens. Now, in a lot of projects, this is the part that's missed out, because it's actually quite expensive to be able to go and see what's happening on the ground, or to build in monitoring systems goes beyond the training course, and a lot of ministries, organizations, project managers tend not to think beyond that event of the training course. But we do need to think beyond that, because the real work happens after the training, not during the training. It happens when you're back in class with your own students in your own context, using the methodology on the ground. And that's what we really need to look at. And that doesn't just, looking at it in short term doesn't work. You need to look at it in the medium, so after about 6 months, and the long term, after a year. Are they still using the methodologies, these new ideas that we've learned about during this conference? Have they used them at all? Did they take them up? Are they using them successfully? Have they evolved them? Have they changed those methodologies and made them their own? What happens after the training course? So evaluating regularly where teachers are on that development process is really important. And of course, when you find out what they are doing with the methodologies that you've introduced, being responsive to them. What more support do they need? Is there something that they could do that would make the methodology more effective? Some small changes that we can bring to them, or an adjustment to the project or the training course that might help them to use that methodology more effectively. That leads to re-examining the needs and working out how we can take them to the next step. What happens after this particular training course, or what happens after we have, how do we better meet the needs of those teachers? What do we have to provide for them to enable them to create that vision that we were looking at the beginning of the process? In Ethiopia, we had to be particularly flexible. We discovered the original idea was to only train school inspectors, But we found out that the school inspectors were not really the most appropriate audience for that project. So we looked at the situation, and during the needs analysis, we suggested to the British Council that it would be better to have the head teachers and the classroom teachers involved in this process. So we ended up having trios of people from the same school, the head teacher, the school inspector, and the classroom teacher, who were working together in a collaborative way. And that had the effect of flattening the power structure in the schools and better enabling the environment for integrating coaching skills into the feedback process. In Cuba, we've been working on this for, my colleague Alan Pulvernis has been working on this for the last 2 years. He's had multiple trips out there, and we're nudging the Education Ministry towards looking at a larger development plan. It is difficult to get people to change the way that they've always done things, and so regular repeated stimulus and suggestion of new ways of doing things is the first step really in getting them to acknowledge that there may be a better way of doing things than they are now. Yeah, we are constantly monitoring that situation and listening to the ministry's needs and trying to meet them. In France, we are getting reports from when they go back to class in between the two training periods is a form of monitoring, and then beyond that, the schools then have to write reports for the British Council to talk about how they're evolving the Clil approach in their schools. That goes to the Education Ministry as well, and then the Ministry of Education uses that to base the next training on. And they're having yearly trainings in each of the provinces that we're working in. What we're trying to do here then, as an organisation, what TransformELT tries to do is develop systemic change. Now, a lot of organisations out there seem to believe that cascades are the best way to do this. Now, a cascade is when, if I'm a trainer, I train you to train other people, and then that multiplies the number of people who are being trained. The problem is that a lot of cascades use teachers who have never been trainers before, or who are using a methodology that they haven't used in class. And so information can get lost quite dramatically as you go down a cascade. I don't believe that I think cascades need to be very carefully engineered for them to work properly, and the skills and types of methodologies that can be trained through cascade is quite limited. School-based development is a different approach, where the school looks at what resources it has, what people it has, decides how they're going to best use the resources of the school to implement a new methodology, or to do something like implementing a sustainability program like Clyde was talking about. School-based development puts the onus on the local teachers, head teachers. It does need strong leadership from head teachers and year heads or section heads to work. It very rarely just happens from the ground up, but it can do. Viral spread is a different form of you all know about videos that go viral. Well, teacher development can go viral as well. If you're doing something good and popular in your school, and another teacher hears about it, they'll get interested and want to spread that. If you go out and tell people in your local area what you're doing, what great results you're having with your sustainability program, for example, then that's likely to spread quite quickly. You can engineer that viral spread as well by creating forums for development and introducing things like teachers clubs, where teachers from different schools get together to exchange ideas on a regular basis, and that can help the spread, promote the spread of new methodologies and pedagogies. So looking at change as an ecosystem, the education system is an ecosystem, and there are multiple points in it that need to be stimulated to enable methodological change to take place. That might be to do with the textbooks, the materials that are available, the exam system, the actual approaches used in the classroom, the inspectorate, the school leadership. It depends on what change you're talking about as to which parts of those buttons need to be pressed at the same time. And it might not just be one button. You might need to press two or three at the same time to enable that system change to happen. If you go to our website, you'll see this theory of change diagram. I'm not going to talk through this. There is a written description of it on the website under our approach statement. So if you're interested in looking at that, please do. You will see the process there of how we go about generating projects and stimulating teacher change, which is what it's all about, changing our methodologies and becoming better at using those methodologies and stimulating people, create talented teachers to come up with their own approaches and pedagogies that work with their students and then promoting them. So I hope that's been of some interest to you. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Somebody's made a point there, I think it's Maral, saying evaluating is really useful for both students and teachers. I think teachers need to evaluate themselves and evaluate their approaches and the pedagogies they use all the time. I think there is a danger of using a pedagogy because it's the way we've always done it, or because it looks good on paper, and so you try out a new idea just because other people are doing it and it sounds good, but it might not be appropriate for your context. You need to be critical about the methodologies that you're using. See whether they are appropriate for your students or not, and get the information from the students themselves. Make sure that you're asking the students whether they think this new way of working is a step forward from the previous way of working, or is it just a bit too difficult, a bit too much, or boring? Is the main criticism that learners come up with. Except examining, what are the different ways of evaluating? Well, my favorite approach to evaluation, well, there are a couple of actually. Doing surveys with your students, or turning the classroom into a focus group discussion. Have a public discussion with your students about what is happening in your classroom. Do they like the stories that you're using? What other ideas do they have for methodologies that they'd like to do? Is there anything that would make them work harder if you change something in the classroom? But asking them, I think, is the most important thing. Doing a test is not great. I'm not a fan of tests, but there are plenty other kinds of things that you can do. Things like self-assessments are very useful, having the students think about their own language ability and develop their ability to be critical about their own language learning, how they're learning, what they're doing to actually develop their language ability, and how they could do it better. What's the future of the experimental Clil program in France? That's a very, very good question. I'm not entirely sure that anybody knows that. I think what they're doing at the moment is really just trying different ways of implementing it. So in some schools, they're replacing subjects in French with some subjects in French with some subjects subjects in English. So maths, for example, in some schools is being taught in English in some schools, but in other schools they're doing it a different way. they're teaching the concepts in math in French first, and then having another class where they do the whole of the same lesson again in English. That's a very different approach. There are some schools where they're also teaching part of the lesson in English and part of the lesson in French. So they're moving between languages in different ways. What it's going to end up looking like, I think it will need a very detailed
Thank you. Don't have any more time.
Research study on that to find out what really is working.
That's a quick answer, right?
Is the best way to do it.
So, on behalf of the YLTSIG committee
to the trainers,
members, I would like to thank Alan and all.
Amanda's question, I was just going to say the answer to that is yes.
Web conference. Thank you very much for that. And all right. And now we're going to have a 10-minute break, and we'll be back.
I'd like to, can I invite anyone who's interested in becoming a consultant for us to forward their CVs to us and get in touch